I never spoke to him. I knew his name, but it was years before I realized who he was. I was a student in Paris at last, searching for something to read among the bouquinistes. A thin, unshaven man with a tired, dog-eared collection pushed a volume into my hand. "Ici, monsieur, un livre merveilleux. It is the sporting of our times." It was the Abject, an old French edition. I was ashamed of my ignorance and showed it to the friend I was with. "Do you know it?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "It's his masterpiece." He died before the war. It was only that evening when I sat down to read and saw his name did I once again remember the old man in the chair, the hazy sun, the sea, and the sand. We'd been at the hotel for a week before he appeared. I was bored on the long train journey from Poland, watching field after field rushing past. "Find a boy to play with," said Maria, as Mother and Mademoiselle dozed in our compartment. "But there are none in this carriage," I said, "and Mother told us to stay here." "Always doing what Mummy says," Olga jeered. "Don't you?" I asked. "Yes," she replied, "but I'm a girl." For the rest of the journey, I remained silent, wavering between anger and self-pity and a hatred towards all three of my sisters. The hotel was full at the height of the season. At dinner the first evening, we followed Mother around, greeting people we knew. I was especially happy to see the Andrzejewskis, especially their son Yashu, a boy a couple of years older than myself. There were families and friends we were sure to get to know. But looking around, I was slightly disappointed, as if I'd expected someone, an old friend or a new acquaintance, who wasn't there. Most days, whatever the weather, we went to the beach, with a parasol and a table in front of our cabin. The sea air was good for my health, Mother said, for she was never convinced that the shortness of breath I'd suffered when I was younger would not return. She would sit quietly and calmly, reading and writing her correspondence. Mademoiselle fussed with bags and towels and all the rest of the paraphernalia. My sisters sat primly and gossiped, keeping out of the sunlight, occasionally brushing sand from their clothes. I didn't realize it, but they did not enjoy themselves. Too old to play games, they could only sit and talk and go for walks no further than Mother allowed. I, meanwhile, a 14-year-old boy, could play with other children, build sandcastles, rush into the water, lie on the sand whenever I wished. All I had to suffer was Mother's frown and Mademoiselle's fussy reminders not to exert myself, reminders that I usually manage to ignore. 14. Neither a boy nor a man. By day I was a child, running, laughing, playing hide and seek. My favourite refuge was an alcove in a distant corridor. I knew that if Yashu was the hunter, he would leave me till last. If pursued, he would slip in beside me, whispering private jokes, which I didn't always understand. At night, at dinner, everything was very different. Sometimes I felt very adult, and spoke with an adult's gravity, paying great attention to what I said. And my sisters would laugh at me. I would be angry and sit stubbornly silent until Mother threatened me with bed. At other times, I resented sitting in stiff clothes while my sisters laughed their silly laugh. Mother and Mademoiselle discussed our education, and the guests around us clinked their noisy cutlery and talked and talked and talked. There were too many of them, I wanted to be alone, or with a close friend, or far, far away. In truth, I didn't know what I wanted. Only that within me there was an unknown need, an itch that tormented, just out of reach. Oh, to be free, I thought to myself, ignorant of what freedom was, or what it might be for. One morning I came out of the water, shivering with cold. Wrapped in a towel, I lay face down in the sand, the sun on my back, and I closed my eyes. In that strange darkness, my mind wandered between consciousness and sleep, between individuality and the universal. I sensed new emotions, emotions that I didn't recognize or understand, emotions that I was not yet ready to embrace. Slowly I opened my eyes, and in the harsh sunlight I saw only one thing: an old man in a deck chair reading a book. I knew he was old from his clothes, from the careful manner with which he turned the pages, from his calm expression. Disorientated still, it seemed to me the world was a void in which only this stranger floated. Unthinkingly, I stared at him until his glance fell on mine. Suddenly, aware of my rudeness, I closed my eyes and wished him away. The day was hot, and I began to doze. And when I awoke, he'd gone. Over the next few days, I sometimes saw him in the hotel, an old man alone, dull and uninteresting. One morning after breakfast, he seemed to leave. He said farewell to the manager, fussily distributed his tips, and walked out of the hotel. But that night, he was back in his usual place, carefully studying his newspaper as he delicately spooned his soup. Perhaps it was the next day that I realized that he was watching me. We'd gone to the beach as usual, but I was in a solitary mood, and I left the others to walk down to the water's edge, occasionally kicking over waves as they fell over my feet. Whatever I was looking for, I didn't find. Eventually, I ambled back, glancing at figures on the sand. There was the old man, a newspaper on his lap, flapping in the breeze, his hat covering his eyes. But the closer I came, the more certain I was that he was watching me. Every step that I took, even the rise and fall of my breath, was as intense to him as my first vision of him had been to me. The closer I came, the stronger the gaze. I was embarrassed. I didn't know what to do. I could neither look at him nor stop him looking at me. I continued walking, because I was already moving, until finally, and with some relief, I passed him and found myself safe in mother's smile and greeting. At ease again, I sat down by the water's edge to build a sandcastle, a feat of engineering, of great towers and tunnels, bridges and moats. Some of the other children came to help me, but this was my sandcastle, and I would allow nothing done without my approval. By lunchtime, it was complete, monumental. When Mother came down to inspect it, I looked up and saw the old man's empty deck chair. But it wasn't long before I saw him again and again and again. Everywhere I went, the old man was there. In the hotel corridor, I could quickly pass him or look down and walk away when he wasn't looking. on the beach. He stayed for hours. A book in his lap, his eyes covered by his hat, and always, always watching me. It was exactly the same at dinner. Mother always insisted that I sit on her right. His table was near ours, and every so often his eyes would leave the page, search the room, and linger imperceptibly on me. Why was he watching me? In later years, I came to expect that kind of look on the faces of strangers who came into my life. But I was too young then to understand what it meant. His gaze seemed like a punishment for something I didn't deserve. I began to hate it. I wanted to make him stop. But I didn't know how to do so. I certainly couldn't tell Mother. One of the hotel guests has been watching you, she would say, her eyebrows arched. You must have offended him. And then, of course, my sisters would laugh at me for being frightened of an old man. So I would sit silently and hope that he would leave me alone. One night, I was ill with a fever after staying out too long in the sun. I lay in bed, alternately pushing the covers away, pulling them over me, when suddenly I was convinced that the old man was in the room, watching me, his hat in his hand, his piercing eyes, his thick moustache curled into a frown. He was paying me back for my rudeness that first day when I'd stared at him on the sands. More than that, he was judging me, punishing me. He knew everything about me, the sum of my history, the list of my faults. Nor was he just the old man. He was every man in authority over me. My tutor displeased with my work, the policeman suspecting me of broken windows, my father displeased with a lapse in manners. But I had done nothing wrong. I'd neither lied nor stolen, drunk no spirits, smoked no cigarettes. I'd only stared at him by mistake. I lay there sweating, his bespectacled eyes relentlessly staring down at me. I couldn't breathe. I kicked away the covers and tore at the neck of my nightgown. Dimly I was aware that I was ill. I should pull the bell rope and summon Mother. But I wanted to see this through on my own. With sudden strength, I sat up, pulled off my nightgown, and fell back on the bed. Apologize, I told myself. Apologize to the shadow hovering over me. But when my mouth opened, it gasped, "No! No! No!" Until my voice died and the old man faded. The room was empty. A shaft of moonlight pouring in through a gap in the curtain. I was covered in sweat. I stood up to get a towel and took out a fresh nightgown, looked at it and let it fall back into the drawer. Nightgowns bothered me like stiff collars on clean shirts. Besides, what if Mother was to come in and wake me as she sometimes did? I could lock the door, even though she'd forbidden it. But for the first time, I'd survived an attack on my own, without Mother or Mademoiselle ministering menthol and hot water. Feeling shaky, but adult and strong. I went to the door and turned the key. And I lay back in my bed. I stretched out, sheets rubbing against my naked body. It seemed like the most delicious thing that I could ever do. Sleep came easily and was undisturbed. I woke early in the morning, and in the pale dawn light I looked out of the window and I saw on the beach only an old man and a boy putting up parasols, and in the distance a youth was painting a cabin. I longed to join them, to stroll along the sand, dive into the sea, wash away my sleep and my childhood. I would be, I decided, a wanderer, a sailor setting out to sea, a man amongst men, rugged, strong, tanned and free. In a year or two's time, when I was old enough, I would set out on my own path, not that of my parents' choosing. Exultant, alive, I threw open the window, breathed in the sea air. Its rumours of salt, travel, and foreign lands. Beware of what you long for, young man. Your wishes might be granted. In my newfound confidence, I decided that I would approach the old man and apologise if I thought I'd offended. I entered the breakfast room, he looked up and saw me. I went to his table, but I did not avert my eyes. And then, for the first time, I saw the old man's expression was not disapproval, hostility, anger, or contempt. It was as if my presence both amazed him and made him afraid. Suddenly he turned away, and I, forgetting all resolve, passed him by and found myself greeting my family, sitting in my usual chair. "Did you sleep well?" Mother asked. I nodded. Last night's attack as far removed from my mind as if it had never occurred. Coffee was poured in my cup, a roll set on my plate. My sisters prattled, but I was lost in my own little world. What was it that I'd seen in the eyes of the old man? Whatever it was, I was no longer afraid of him. I was sure I might have something to gain. From that moment on, I would not turn away or avoid him when his eyes filled mine. Wherever I went, he seemed to be. Sometimes I sensed him before he appeared. He seldom looked directly at me, but focused on something nearby, one of the children playing beside me, a vase of flowers at an adjacent table, or the dessert trolley offered to us by a waiter. When our eyes met, his gaze was hypnotic. Between us, it seemed to see that there is a mystery, a secret that only the two of us share. And then sometimes his face would lift. He almost seemed to smile at me, offering a slight movement of the mouth, a twinkle in the eye that dissolved as soon as I noticed it. Under that gaze, I often shivered, a sensation as keen and as delicate as when I was naked and alone. From Mother, who made it her business to know all the guests, I learned that he was a writer, well known in Germany, deservedly less fashionable in Poland. I wasn't quite sure how a writer worked. He would sit outside his cabin with pen and paper and a serious expression, but he might have been composing no more than a serious letter to his bank. I sometimes tried to imagine him at a desk, eyes wide, scribbling over paper, pausing briefly to think of a word or a phrase. It was no more than a caricature. Indeed, I could not imagine him anywhere except the Lido and any other activity other than eating, resting, or walking. His attention anywhere except on me. I began to feel as if I possessed him. I recognized his clothes, how recently he shaved, the books, the newspapers he read, even the food he preferred. Bit by bit, his appearance was changing. A new suit, lighter in colour, more modern in cut. His straw hat replaced by one of felt. There were rings on his fingers, a flower in his lapel, even a brightly coloured handkerchief in his breast pocket. In my youthful arrogance, I assumed these changes were meant for me, and I would respond in kind, paying great attention to the way I behaved, acting more like the adult that I so desperately wanted to be. Adult? Huh! I was still half boy. And like all adolescents, I was capricious. I began to acknowledge him in the same way that I received all compliments, more indifferent than grateful. Sometimes I pretended to ignore him, looking or walking away when I saw him coming. But then I would be ashamed, unable to rest until he came into view, and I could reassure him I'd not rejected him. Once, when Mother took us into town and I hadn't seen him all day, he was waiting at the hotel when I returned. I smiled, as if I might have been greeting an old friend. It was a mistake. He frowned as if to say you'd gone too far, turned aside and walked away. When I wasn't with my family, there was always Yashu and the rest of the boys with whom I joked, played, and fought. Yashu was the friend that I told everything to. With him, I shared my dream of one day making my way in the world as an adventurer, and he swore to join me. We whispered and giggled and told each other stories that all boys tell of the mysteries of sex and powerful dreams that fill us with excitement and guilt. And it was at moments like this that he would tightly grasp me. But I was too young, too naive to understand what he wanted, or to see in the old man's quieter gaze his excited eyes. More often, our talk was down to earth. My annoying sisters, the day I would join my father's law firm, his quarrelling parents, the rank he might achieve in the army. He got his wish. For one brief summer, Yashu was the pride of his town and family. Until he fell at Kostyutnovka. Time passed, punctuated by occasional visits to Venice and letters from father. I'm ashamed to say the city bored me. I saw nothing beautiful in it. It was full of dark alleys and deep bridges that led from one collection of unsavoury smells to another, full of bickering peasants, pestering peddlers, and disfigured beggars. Each Sunday we would go to San Marco for the never-ending Mass. And each Sunday he would be there. I began to question God, and while the others bowed their heads in prayer, I only half leaned forward, my eyes still open. Once I turned to look at the old man. He was sitting bolt upright, his head bare, intently staring at me. But the expression in his eyes, deep pain, supplication, and need. Troubled, startled, I bent my head and tried to make sense of what it was that I'd seen. He seemed to be asking me for something that I couldn't give. Something much greater than I possessed. If I'd been older or more precocious, I might have called it my soul. I didn't know how to respond. I was shaken, thrilled even, for what he'd shown me was denied to the rest of the world. His entreaty, a gift so precious that it couldn't be refused. In later years, I came to see that look on the faces of too many men and women whose lives crossed with mine. And it was only then that I realized the old man's need gave me power. If only the power to accept him or turn him away. And it was only then that I realized that his presence, his obsession, his longing created a need in me. A need that has never been fulfilled. Cholera. Mother told us of the disease that was keeping tourists away from Venice, but we wouldn't leave because father was expected. And so we stayed. And each day the dining room got emptier, the tennis courts seldom played, fewer cabins were open on the beach. I was too young to concern myself too much with death and disease. They were the afflictions of the poor that had not yet touched my life. Creatures of darkness and dirt that lurked in slums and alleys where I didn't go. Nor did I associate them with the old man, although I noticed he was aging. A greyness hung over him, as it hung over the city on warm, sultry days when the sun never appeared. His face was drawn, his colour sallow, his movement slower. One Sunday, as we strolled through Venice after Mass, and the old man followed at a distance because he couldn't keep up with Mademoiselle's sprightly pace, I looked back and I thought I saw him fall. I hesitated, but then I continued walking, angry with myself that I had not left my family and gone to help him. It was with some relief that night that I found him back in the dining room, more animated than usual, fussing over the food and the service. The next evening at dinner, I looked across at the old man's table and saw a young man in his place. A young man with dark, unnaturally bright hair, red puffy cheeks, and sunken eyes under thick black brows. Untrustworthy and effeminate, I told myself, but even as that opinion was forming, I saw who he was. He looked up and stared at me, and even in my youth I recognized the emotion that struggled through the makeup. "I have done this for you," it said. "Do you like it? Please, please tell me that you do." Stunned, my mouth dry, my heart racing, I turned away. I couldn't think, I couldn't talk, I almost spilled my soup. And when Mother asked me what was wrong, I smiled and reassured her and continued eating and talking as if nothing had changed. What I wanted to do was to run away, lock myself in my room. There I could cry, shout, beat the bed, do anything to expel this violent emotion that was surging up within me. Only then, when I lay exhausted, and I tried to make sense of this feeling of being betrayed, but I couldn't move. My mind swirled in pain and confusion. I could only sit and talk politely to Mother, listen to my irritating sisters, and keep my eyes from the man sitting a few tables away from me, who, like a snake, had crawled back into its shedded skin. "Damn you," I told myself, using a word I never allowed myself to use. "Damn you for what you've done to yourself and what you're doing to me!" That night, I dreamt of him again. The young man with the old man's eyes reached out to me, brought his face to mine, whispered in my ear. I was excited. I was frightened. I wanted him close to me. I wanted to push him away. Then he became a being. Young, old, male, female, hideous, and beautiful. I reached out to embrace him. Our bodies touched, and we kissed. But in that kiss, he faded. And I awoke trembling to find myself clasping the bolster, the covers twisted and lying at the end of the bed. I knew what had happened. I knew I wanted to happen again. What I didn't know is whether I wanted it with him or with anyone other than him. Oh, Tadzio. As a boy, you looked forward to a life filled with life, convinced that the old man was your gatekeeper to a new world, where mysteries would gradually reveal themselves. But he was your jailer, who never set you free. For 40 years, you have haunted me, old man. You abandoned me in Venice, but on that day when I picked up your masterpiece in Paris, still a youth, still a virgin in body and soul, you swept back into my life, and you've never left it since. For 40 years you followed me, from Venice to Paris to London and back to Venice. Everywhere I went, whoever I was with, you were there, deep in the eyes of the men and women who pursued me, who took me to their beds, who insinuated their lives into mine. I had hoped that one of them would give me what you promised. But none of them could. They simply took from me what they wanted and left me emptier and more alone than before. You haunted me, old man. You haunted and destroyed me! You destroyed him? The next day I went down to breakfast. The old man was sitting at his usual chair, his hair still thick and black, but his face as pale as before. As he looked up, I saw his expression was calmer, but his face was still filled with longing. Some of last night's anger returned to me, but it was tempered with curiosity, pity, and contempt. Once more our silent relationship had changed, a change that both disturbed me and dissatisfied me. I looked around the dining room, avoiding his eyes, trying to convey to him that I wanted more from him, or nothing at all. But whatever there was between us could not be as before. The same day at lunch, Mother told us we were leaving Venice. Father had heard about the cholera and insisted that we go home. Once, I'd have been pleased, excited even, at the idea of my own room again, my toys, my books, even school. But this year was different. I didn't want to leave. I needed to know what the old man was offering me, what I would lose if we left. As a child, I could have run to my mother and blurted out what it was that I wanted. But I was on the brink of manhood. There were secrets that couldn't be revealed. I looked for the old man, but he wasn't there. Surrounded by my family, I felt utterly alone. The next day, the day of our departure, we went to the beach one last time. There were few people about. The old man in his chair, motionless. Yashu and I splashed water at each other. Some sand hit him in the face. I laughed. He got angry. He leapt at me. I hadn't realized how strong, how masculine he was. And he knocked me down, sat on my back, pulled up an arm so hard I thought it would break. I shouted, begged for mercy through tears. He pushed my face into the sand. Frightened and alone, I was unable to shake him off. I could only lie there, sure I was going to die. Finally, he let me go. And I sat up, my mouth full of grit. I was angry. I was hurt. I got up and walked away, ignoring him when he ran after me. I found myself at the water's edge, wondering what to do, where to go. The water had receded, leaving an island of sand. I pointed it out to the others. but no one noticed. I walked forward, climbed up onto the sandbar. This was my little kingdom. I would stay here forever. My family could leave me in Venice and leave me alone. Slowly, I walked along the thin strip of sand that was now my new small domain. As I turned, I saw a cluster of people around the old man's chair. Frightened, I ran into the water, cursed myself for slowing me down, tried to swim, stood up again, and ran back to the beach. I saw Mother's figure, heard her taking command. Olga turned and saw me coming. She whispered, "It's Mr. Aschenbach. I think he's dead." Peering over shoulders, I caught a glimpse of a pale, drawn figure, slumped to the side, eyes half closed, saliva dribbling from the mouth. I thought it cruel and vulgar that people should stand and stare. I turned, walked away, and headed back to the sea. I should feel sad, I thought. There should be tears, but my eyes remained dry. I knew I had lost something, but I didn't know what it was. And in that moment, it made the pain easier to bear. What I didn't know was that the pain would never go away. I never spoke to him.